Let's get more on Ukraine now. And Andrew Wilson is a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Joins us live from London. Andrew, we're seeing an awful lot of posturing here, especially in the Crimea, a huge show of force from the Russians. But just how far do you think they're going to go?
Well, they've already gone a lot farther than people expected. Initially, well, at least until a week ago, they seemed to be playing a longer game, probably confident that the new government in Kiev wouldn't last very long. But they have control of Crimea. The question now is whether they'll try and extend their influence, probably in different ways, through the rest of Russian-speaking southern and eastern Ukraine. There were a lot of rallies at the weekend which seemed to be orchestrated by the Russians in support of the Russians.
But the Ukraine is a very different story to Georgia, for example, isn't it? Which is the last time we saw such incursion of troops. And Crimea has significant support for Kiev as well.
Well, completely different in two ways. In 2008, when Russia went to war with Georgia, the Georgians were provoked, but they were provoked to firing first by most credible accounts. So Russia had something of a casus belli. It doesn't really here. It hasn't really constructed a plausible cover story for its operation at all. The only Russian who's been killed in the current crisis was shot dead by snipers in Kiev. Crimea does have a majority Russian population, but about a quarter of the population are Ukrainians and about 13% of Crimean Tatar. They held a big demonstration in support of the authorities in Kiev last Wednesday, and the seizure of power seems to have been a response to that, to try and circumvent it.
Looking ahead to today, we've got a EU foreign ministers emergency meeting being held in Brussels. We just heard William Hague earlier in Kiev saying we'll have to look at that to see what consequences come out of that. What do you think they're likely to do?
Well, nobody is really talking about a military response. That would, I guess, be up to the Americans anyway. Diplomatic measures are possible. That's not for all of the EU, because the favourite measure is the G8 meeting. Either we boycott that or we start meeting as the G7 without Russia. There will be protests. The EU are always good at strongly worded objections, often little wool. But the key thing is Russia's economic interests, particularly in the European Union. They already have the Nord Stream gas pipeline to the Baltic Sea. Now that benefits from certain exemptions under EU energy laws that can be looked at. And then the Russians are planning to build this second gas pipeline through the Black Sea into the Balkans. That hasn't happened. We can look at whether it should happen and whether it should have the exemptions that the Russians are kind of pushing for under EU law. There are things we can do to put the heat on Russia economically, at least.
OK. Andrew Wilson, thank you very much for joining us there from London with your thoughts on the crisis ongoing in Ukraine.